We'll take a look at Daf Lamed Amud Aleph, and we're towards the bottom of the Amud, and we're trying to figure out when the Kohen Gadol goes into the Azara on Yom Kippurim, what does he need in preparation? So Shalu es ben Zoma, Tvila zu Lama. When he goes into the Azara, he needs a Tvila, even if he's tar. And the Gemara wants to know why. Amalahem, so Ben Zoma responds, Kal v'chomer. He has a Kal v'chomer. Ma hamishane mikodesh l'kodesh. If the Kohen Gadol, on 5 different occasions, he goes from one Makom Kodesh, like the Azara, to another Makom Kodesh, like the Kodesh Kadoshim, during the course of his 5 major avodos of Yom Kippurim, in 2 of these places, if he would go in and he's tameh, he's chayiv kares, and he's ton tefillah. So again, both places are kodesh. One is the Azara, and the other is the higher level of kedusha, which is the kodesh kadoshim. And in either of these places, he's chayiv kares if he was tameh. And now he needs tefillah. Again, we don't know exactly why he needs tefillah, but he needs tefillah. For example, even though he's tar, he needs tefillah. And the reason why we know he's tar is because before he started his morning service in the Talmud Shel Shachar, he had to do a tefillah. Is Hamashana Michol Lekodesh, if he comes from a Makom Chulin that has no Kedusha at all, and he goes into the Beis HaMikdash, which is a Makom Kadosh, and he's going from a Makom She'ein Onish Kares to a Makom She'onish Kares. So in other words, the discrepancy between place X and place Y, when he goes from a Makom Chulin into a Makom Kadosh, is so much greater than that of when he goes from Kodesh to Kodesh, because if he walks into a Makom Kodesh from a Makom Chol, he's going from a Makom She'ein Onish Kares to a Makom She'onish Kares, is Einu Din Sheton Tefillah. How much more so does he need tefillah, even though he's tar? Now, if we take a look at Rashi, Rashi says tefillah zu. That's the first Rashi in the Gemara, about 10 lines up from the bottom of the Yom. He says shel shachris, shel kol shachris. So in other words, the Gemara, according to Rashi, shel kol shachris, is asking not only about Yom Kippurim, but any day of the year. Whenever the Kohen Gadol, or for that matter, any Kohen, goes into the Mikdash to do the Avodah, and we're talking about the Talmud Shel Shachar in the morning, he needs Tefillah. And this Tefillah apparently is D'Oraisa. Certainly the first Tefillah of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim is also D'Oraisa. And we're talking about going from a place that's Kares to a place that's Kares on Yom Kippurim. Like we said before, he goes from the Azara into the Kodesh Kadoshim, he needs a Tefillah. And how much more so does he need Tefillah when he goes from a Makom Chol into a Makom Kodesh? So let's look at Rashi. Rashi says, Uma hameshana mikodesh Kohen Gadol b'chamesh avodos b'Yom Kippurim. Hameshtanos michutz lipnim umipnim lechutz. And shnei hamakomos kodesh, while shneim onush kares. Hanichnas b'tuma ton tefillah. He needs tefillah being avodah levodah k'niyolef b'pirkin. So Rashi tells us that we'll have to wait till Daf Lamed Beis until we derive this from a pasuk. Is Zeh Habami Beis Ola Azara Shehu Michol El HaKodesh? How much more so does he need Tvila? Now, on the side of the Amud, at least in my print, there's something called Tosus Yishanim. You have that? Tosus Yishanim?
Yep.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So we're looking for a paragraph here, which is in my Gemara again. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 lines up from the bottom of the Amud. Uma, towards the end of that line. Umaha mishana mikodesh lekodesh v'chuli pirish b'kuntrus.
Yep, got it.
Makom kadosh l'makom kadosh that we saw in Rashi b'kosher. Or hainu demasik basar hachi mimakom sha'anish karis l'makom v'chuli treizimni lamali. According to Rashi's interpretation, the Gemara is really repeating itself, because on the one hand it says ma mishana mikodesh lekodesh, and it also says mimakom sha'anish karis l'makom sha'anish karis. I mean, that's all the same. There's no difference between the two. The ode, and furthermore, lishna de mikodesh lekodesh lo mashma hachi. The way Rashi is saying it, that mikodesh lekodesh means from one place where he'll be chayav kares if he enters in as a tamei. Havi le'lemeimah ben kodesh lekodesh. Right, because the language of the Gemara is mikodesh lekodesh. And he says it should have said ben kodesh likodesh. Okay. Al kei nira le Rebbe. I don't know who Rebbe is. One of the Baliatosis. Dimi kodesh likodesh hainu chemichanami big day kodesh le big day kodesh. He changes his begad, because as long as he's outside the kodesh kadoshim, he wears big day zav. And then he goes into the Kodesh Kadoshim and he wears big day Lavan. Big day Lavan the big day Zahav. So every time he changes his begadim from big day Zav to big day Lavan and vice versa, he has to go into the mikveh to be Tovel. And again, we don't know what the source for that is. The Gemara is going to derive that. And therefore, so if he's going from, where does he start with Zav, right? Let me just make sure I got the Seder right. Just 1 second. Yeah, Migdei Zav, Migdei Lavan. So I guess he's assuming that both Big Day Lavan and Big Day Zav are both Kodesh. So it doesn't matter which direction he's going, whether he's going from Big Day Zav to Big Day Lavan or vice versa, but he always requires a tefillah to change his begadim. And certainly when he's wearing ordinary clothes and he's not in the Beis HaMikdash and he enters in and puts on his begadim for the first time, for sure he's going to need a tefillah. Now, he says the following. I have a footnote here in the name of the Gvuras Ari. He says, according to Rashi, the Kavachomer is mitzad knisa mimakom kodesh to makom kodesh acher. He's going from one makom kodesh to another makom kodesh. He says, lechora, ain't shinui hamakom gorem lo es chiyuv atvila. Again, this is all based on the sugya Daf Lamed Beis. You know, the trouble here is that, you know, you're learning Daf Lamed and you have to know Daf Lamed Beis. But the Gemara in Daf Lamed Beis is going to establish that the reason why you need Shini Begad, the reason why you need Tvila, is not because of Shini Makom, but rather because of Shini Begadim. And Rashi's putting the emphasis on a person who goes into the Azara. He says, Ein Tama Tvila Sherotzim L'chayvo Mishum Achlofas Begadim. He says when he enters into the Azara, there, the Machayev, the reason why he's Chayev Tvila is because of Shini Makom, because he's going into the Azara. So how does the Gemara derive a kal v'chomer from shinu begadim to shinu makom? And Rashi's putting all the emphasis here on shinu makom. But in truth, the Gemara says later on that it's not shinu makom that generates the chiyuv tefillah, but rather shinu begadim. And therefore, Tosas Yeshanim comes up and he says, Mikodesh lekodesh means from big day kodesh to big day kodesh, whether it's Lavan to Zav or Zav to Lavan. So at least according to the Tosas Yeshanim, we understand what the Gemara is driving at here, that there's a kal v'chomer that if he's chayiv tvila because of shinu v'gadim, then certainly when he goes from big day chol into big day kodesh, certainly he should require a tvila. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, serech tvila hizu. In other words, we're not talking about a doraisa, and the reason why he needs tvila if he's already tar is only derabanan, and that's called serech tvila. So it's not mikra adin; it's a separate takana, and the purpose of this takana is laorer es hamachshava, that he should be aware of the fact that he is constantly warned, and he has to be meticulous and careful about the fact that he's constantly aware of the fact that he's got to be taught. Now, the word serach or serech is a lashon of davar hadavuk, something that's attached. So again, his mind has to be attached to Tara. In other words, because of this tefillah that the Rabbanan were masakin that required a tefillah, he's going to concentrate and think, wait a minute, tefillah is for tmeim. And now he's going to begin to think, maybe I have some sort of a tumah. Maybe I forgot about it. Maybe I came in contact with a corpse or in an oil of a corpse or something of that sort. And our ultimate goal is that Yifrosh, he'll be parish from his avoda. After his tefillah, he'll say, wait a minute, you know what? I have to wait until Herev Shemesh. And it's not enough that I went into the mikvah. And all this is going to remind him of something that he forgot about, namely that he came in contact with some tumah. Rashi says, "Ein kan chiyuv min haTorah, ela liserech," which means lachpos, to search out b'shem tefillah. Or Rashi says, litfos b'shem tefillah, kidei lahalos al lev she'ein tefillah litmeim, v'loses lelibo im yesh tuma olav, v'yizkar tuma yishana she'esh olav v'shachacha, v'yifrosh milavo la'azor hayom ad she'yarev shimsho achar tefillah v'lo yavod hayom. So this was, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the requirement of tefillah as a takonas chachamim, so that it'll be parish from its avoda until after Harev Shemesh. Now, the Rambam in Perek Beis Mehilchas Avodas Yom HaKippurim writes, Kol ha-tfilos kulam b'migdash chutz mi-tfilah rishona shehu rashoy litbol osa b'chol she'ena el lahosif kavanasa shem yizkar tuma yishana shebiyado yifrosh mimena b'tfilah zu lishma. In other words, when the Gemara says here on the bottom line of the Yom Yifrosh, he means Yifrosh min hatuma. So what's the difference between Rashi? Rashi says Yifrosh means Yifrosh min avoda, or Yifrosh min lavo le'azara, and the Rambam says Yifrosh min tuma. He quotes the Yad David, one of the commentaries on the Rambam. Shalidivre Rashi tefillah zu hi hamataheres somi tumasa. Rashi holds that if he reminds himself that he was Tameh, he came in contact with Tuma, the purpose of this tefillah is to begin the process of Tara and await until Hariv Shemesh. Haram Sover, she'ein medubar al chashash shel Tuma mamish. We're not really worried that he's Tameh, the way Rashi is, If he did contract Tuma, then for sure he went through the process of Tara. And how do we see this in the language of the Rambam? Because the Rambam writes, etc. And then he speaks about going into the Migdash. So the Rambam says that the purpose of this tefillah is in order to be matir, to allow him to go into the Migdash. And if he was tovel without that kavana, kishayitbal ata mitzad takanetz chacham yizkar shahaisalo tumi yishana shelo tovel ba l'shem bias Migdash. V'yitbal achshav l'shma l'shem bias Migdash. So in other words, the Rambam has this very interesting halachic principle that to go into the Mikdash, you need a matir. And what's that matir? The matir is tefillah. And you have to have in mind when you did the tefillah that you're doing it for the sake of bias Mikdash as a matir. And by giving this, by, shall we say, imposing this tefillah, the Rabbanan are guaranteeing that he'll have a tefillah l'shem bias Mikdash. So his Rashi is afraid that maybe he was tameh, and the tefillah is there for the purpose of reminding him that perhaps he is tameh. The Rambam's not worried about the possibility that he was tameh. The Rambam's worried about the possibility that his tefillah was not l'shem bias Migdash, and he needs a kavana l'shma for the purpose of tefillah l'shem bias Migdash. And in an event that he didn't have such a tefillah l'shma, now he's going to have a tefillah l'shma. Now, it seems that Rabbi Yehuda holds that this entire enterprise of tefillah is the Rabbanon. What is he doing with the Kal V'chomer and Ben Zoma? Ben Zoma's Kal V'chomer generates a chiyuv d'oraisa. So he quotes the Meiri that Rabbi Yehuda had a pircha on this Kal V'chomer. Why? Mali Yom HaKippurim shekaparasa meruba macha ein kein b'shar yomim. In other words, even though it's true that on Yom Kippurim we require a tefillah, let's say when he goes from a Makom Kodesh to Makom Kodesh, or according to Tosi Shanim when he changes his begad, that doesn't prove anything about a daily tefillah during the rest of the balance of the year, because on Yom Kippur there's a halach of kapara beruba, right? This is the ultimate day of kapara, and maybe the requirements of tefillah are that much more demanding, more strict than they are the rest of the year. We're trying to prove a tefillah that's required the rest of the year. As Rashi said, kol shall kol shacharis. And what does Ben Zoma hold? He says, Doche Rabbi Yehuda's divrei Ben Zoma, machmas hatam hazeh. He has this pircha on the Kal V'chomer. And the Meiri says that we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, that on a daily basis the requirement of tefillah is only d'Rabbanan, and it was takonas chachamim kidei sha'adam ya'orer bi'atzmo. And that's the final conclusion. We don't accept Ben Zoma that this tefillah is d'oraisa. Well, what I find fascinating is that the whole discussion here about a pircha on the Kal V'chomer is completely omitted from the sugya itself. They're very odd. In any event, Ben Zoma has this Kal V'chomer to derive the conclusion that tefillah shachris for any Kohen who's ba lavod is d'oraisa. Rabbi Yehuda holds it's all d'Rabbanan. And basically, the Gemara in these two shitos is vacillating back and forth, and the Kal V'chomer of Rabbi Ben Zoma would generate a chiyuv d'oraisa, whereas Rabbi Yehuda is only serach tefillah, which means it's a d'Rabbanan. And at this point, the Gemara has no definite conclusion one way or the other. The Ma'ikam Miflagi. All right, let's turn to Daf Lamed Amud Beis. Biachule avoda kamifligis. The machlokis is about chilul avoda, meaning there's going to be a nafkamina between Ben Zoma and Rabbi Yehuda if, in event, the Kohen went in without tefillah. According to Ben Zoma, who derives the chiv tefillah for any Kohen who's going into the Azara, from a Kal V'chomer, from the case of Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippur, who requires tefillah between one avoda and the other avoda, and a Kal V'chomer is a doraisa. Therefore, if the Kohen was not tovel when he came into the Mikdash in the morning and he went to do his avodah, his mechal avoda, his avodah is mechuleles. In other words, the Gemara assumes that according to Zoma, if you derive the chi of tefillah on a daily basis from a Kal V'chomer of a doraisa tefillah of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim, then the tefillah itself is doraisa on a daily basis, and it's ma'akiv. It's absolutely indispensable. Without it, the avodah is psula. I'm thinking out loud. If a Kohen does the avodah when it's avodah mechulelas, I think he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. I wonder if he goes in without tefillah, if he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. It wouldn't be surprising to me if he is, because even without kiddush yadayim raglayim, if he goes in to do the avodah, he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. So certainly without tefillah. But Rabbi Yehuda, he doesn't have this drasha deriving tefillah from a Kal V'chomer. The entire enterprise of tefillah is only a takanas chachamim k'dei sheyala libav yizkar mitma. Therefore, if he went ahead and he did the avodah without tefillah, lo mechal avodah, it's not going to be mechal as avodah. It's a takanas chachamim. It's like a chiyuv mitzvah d'Rabbanan that he should be toveh. So the Gemara now asks the question: Ula ben zoma mi mechil. Is it really so? Can you maintain this position that according to Ben Zoma, if he does the avodah without the tefillah, the avodah is mechuleles? So Asanya, we have a brisa, Kohen Gadol shelo tovel v'lo kidesh. Now we're going back to the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, which is the source for Ben Zoma's Kal V'chomer. So he wasn't tovel, or he wasn't makadesh yodav v'raglov, right in the me'akiyah. Bein beged lebeged ubein avodah levodah, whether it's between one change of garments to another change of garments, or between one avodah and another avodah, is avodah kshera. Now I don't know that this is Ben Zoma. This is a brisa, but it's an anonymous brisa, and from the fact that I guess Ben Zoma's opinion as a dissenting opinion is not quoted in the brisa, we assume that he would agree with this brisa that avodah kshera echad kohen gadol echad kohen hedjot shelo kiddush yodav ragol shachris. So in kohen gadol, when he changes the gadim or he changes avodah, one avodah to another, or kohen hedjot on a daily basis, when he comes in the morning to do the avodah, then he wasn't mekadosh yodav raglov the avad avodaso. Just 1 second. So as far as echad kohen gadol echad kohen hedjot shelo kidesh yodav raglav shachris the yodav avodaso if yodav avodaso psula. So in other words, the Bryce is telling me that a kohen gadol who doesn't have tefillah between his avodah is not psula. But if he starts the day, and this is true not only for a kohen gadol but even for a kohen hedjot, without kiddush yadayim raglayim, then his avodah is psula. Now the Brisa says that a kohen gadol shelo tovel ben avodos ein avodos psula, and Ben Zoma derives the chiv of tefillah on shachris from a Kal V'chomer from the tefillah between the avodos. So then, if the tefillah between the avodos of Yom Kippur of Yom Kohen Gadol is not ma'akev, and the avodah b'diavad without that tefillah is kshera, is then the tefillah of shachris, which is a derivative from the tefillah between avodah and avodah of Yom Kippurim, would certainly not be likuva. It would not undermine and disqualify his avodah. Now again, since the brisa doesn't mention any name, it's an anonymous brisa, we have to assume that Ben Zoma would agree with this brisa. And if the absence, the omission of a tvila between one avoda and the other does not disqualify his avoda, then how much more so the absence of a tvila of a kohen hedgel during the course of the entire year would not disqualify his avoda, because that's a derivative, according to Ben Zoma, of the halacha, the requirement of tvila between avoda and avoda of kohen gadol. Ella, says the Gemara, we have to reinterpret the nafkamina between Rabbi Yehuda and so they both agree that b'di'evet, if he did not implement a tvila between avoda or a tvila in the morning to start the avoda, then b'di'evet the avoda would be kshera. But what's the nafkamina? Let make him be essay called miflagi. They're asking about a person, a kohen who wasn't tovel. And is he in violation of an essay, what we call an Isser Aseh? Liben, someone going to Ben, someone who has a Kalvachomer from Kohen Gadol between the Avodas Kohen the essay. Because the Kohen Gadol Shelo Toval violates an Isser Essay. With regard to Kohen Gadol, it says in the Pasuk by Yikot Tezayin, Kisones Bad Kodesh Yilbash, V'rachatz B'mayim Es B'saro U'Levesham. And the Torah means to say that he has to be Rochetz B'mayim between Kodesh and another Kodesh. And if he doesn't do so, he violates an Isser Essay. And that Isser Essay, which applies explicitly to the case of a Kohen Gadol, is now going to be a source from which we derive a Kohen Hedgel the rest of the year, who goes in to do the Avodah without Tvila. Rabbi Yehuda, who says the entire enterprise of Chiyuv Tvila in the morning before he starts the Avodah is Midivrei Chachamim, Lo Koi B'Essay. He doesn't violate an Isra Aseh. The Isra Aseh is limited to the Kohen Gadol between Avodah and Avodah, where the Torah in Parshas Achrei Mos specifically hones in on the Kohen Gadol, and we can't derive conclusions from Yom Kippurim, which we said is a Kapara Meruba, to the rest of the year. The Gemara now asks, wait a second, Umi Islay Rabbi Yehuda Svara, is it really true that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the tefillah itself is only dirabanan? We're going to ask a kasha from another statement of Rabbi Yehuda with regard to a mitzorah. Now, he's got a whole introduction here to the laws of mitzorah. I'll just give you the gist of it. He says that the din of taras mitzorah, once he's cured from his tzaras, requires that through the tara he has to bring 2 tziporim, and he has to bring an 8 erez shni tolas v'ezov. The kohen will shecht one of the 2 tziporim, the other one he frees to fly the skies, and the dam of that tzipor that he shechted, that the kohen shechted, is poured into a kli. That kli has in it mei mayan, water from a spring, and into this mixture of water and dam, he takes the tzipor chaya together with an 8 erev and a shni tolas and ezov, and then he does a hazah from the damat tzipor, from this mixture, after he did the tefillah, 7 hazos on the mitzorah. Then the mitzorah goes through tiglachas, and he shaves all his hair off his body. Then he goes to the mikveh, he's tovel, he's allowed to come into Yerushalayim. He waits until after he counts another 7 days, and during these 7 days, he's also with Tashmish Hamita, and his status is still that of an avatuma. He's metame adam v'kelim through his maga. These are called yemei sfiro. On the 7th day, once again, he does a second giluach of the seir on his body, and he takes his begadam, he's matbil his begadam in that same mixture, he is tovel a second time, and then he's nitar b'hariv shemesh, and then on the 8th day, he has to bring his karbanos. Then there's something called matan bahomos, which means that the mitzorah has to take his hand inside the Pesach of the Azorah, and he's somech al rosha kevesh of the Asham, before they shecht it, and then he puts his head into the Azora. The Kohen takes the dam of the keves, and puts it on his earlobes, his right earlobe, and then the Mitzorah sticks in his right foot, and he puts some of the dam on the big toe of his right foot, and then he's allowed to put his right leg into the Azora, and the Kohen does this whole process of Boeing Raglov. Then the Kohen does what's called Nesinos Imlug Hashemen. Okay, this is all charted out and mapped out in Parshas Mitzorah Vayikra Yudalid and in Masechet Negoim Perek Yudalid. Fine. So now, Vatanya, we have a brayso that says, with regard to the Seder of Kaparas HaMitzorah on the 8th day, Mitzorah Tovel V'Omei B'Shar Nikanor. Notice he's not allowed to enter into the Azora. He does a tefillah. So he's outside the Azora at the entranceway into the Azora, which is called Shar Nikanor. And they allow him to get as far as the Shar Nikanor, even though he hasn't brought his karbanos yet on the 8th day, but he did everything else that he has to do. And then, as we said before, after he stands on the 8th day at the Shar Nikanor, he puts his hands into the Azora, and he gets Matan Bahonos from the Dam HaOsham, from Lug HaShemen, and Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ein Tzarich Tvila, Shekvar Tovel Mibe'eret. Already on the 7th day, he went through Tvila. He doesn't need another Tvila on the 8th day. We're not afraid of some other tumor that he contracted overnight. Anyway, we see clearly from Rabbi Yehuda that since he's tar, he doesn't need another tefillah on the 8th day. Our Mishnah says that even though the Kohen is tar, when he comes to the Azora and he enters into the Azora to do his avodah on Shachris on the morning, he's got to go through this process of tefillah. Why doesn't the same Takonis Chachamim that applies to a Kohen Hedjot on a daily basis apply to the Mitzorah on the 8th day? And the answer is Hahu Kidasani Taima. Rabbi Yehuda in the Brisa gives his explanation as to why the Mitzorah does not need a tefillah on Yom HaShmini. And he says that's because Shekvar Tovel Mibe'eret. He had already a tefillah on the night before, and now that he's on the 8th day, he's at the entranceway to the Azora. He doesn't need another tefillah. Okay, so now he says the following. The Ritva says, "Eino yochel lios tamei elamachmas tumah chadasha v'arei lekach lo choshu chachamim sheitame tumah chadasha v'ishkechena." In other words, in the case of a Kohen Gadol, we're afraid that maybe he did contract tumah and maybe he forgot about it. But in this case, where he was tovel the night before, he doesn't need. We're not going to be choshesh that between the night before and today he contracted tumah. He came in contact with tumah. So when you come into the Azora and you think you're tar, we're going to ask you to do a tefillah, and maybe you'll remind yourself, maybe you have some old tumah yeshana. But the Mitzorah, who was tovel just yesterday, before sunset yesterday, he was tar, and then we're not going to worry about some tumah yeshana. If he had any tumah yeshana, that tumah yeshana was removed by the tara pras, by the tefillah. So the Gemara says, "The korile, my the korile." What did the Makshan think when he asked this question? I mean, didn't he realize that there's an obvious distinction over here? Because Rabbi Yehuda says explicitly that the reason why the Mitzorah doesn't need another tefillah is because he had a tefillah already last night. So the Gemara answers, "Mishum de kaboy lemirma achriti ale," that the Makshan quotes this brisa because it's an introduction to another kasha. And we only read part of the brisa. Now we're going to read the rest of the brisa. The brisa says, Lishkas HaMitzorayim. Why is this special chamber designated for the Mitzorah? Before they get to Sharon Nikanor, for the Matan Bahonos, in the Azara, they need Tvila. And that's why there's a separate chamber called the Lishkas HaMitzorah. That's the Tanakama. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Lo Mitzorah Bilvad Amru. When we say that the Mitzorah, since he's putting part of his body into the Azara, he needs Tvila. Oh, no. That's not a separate din in Mitzorah. Ella Kol Adam. Anyone who goes into the Azara needs a Tvila. And therefore, it's not fair that you call this chamber where the mikveh is a Lishkas HaMitzorah. It's not a Lishkas HaMitzorah. Because anyone who goes in to the Azara requires Tvila. Now it says Kol Adam, so I assume he means even a hedjot. Even if he's not going for the avoda, he needs Tvila. And in the note here, he says that on the top, he gives you a little bit of a summary of the top Tosfos. He says that what we see in Rabbi Yehuda is that he argues on the Seifa to say that once there's a requirement of Tefillah for Mitzorah, who goes into the Azara, I shouldn't say goes into the Azara, but part of it is therefore Kol Adam Harotze Likonis Lazara also requires Tefillah. Or Tosfos has another possibility that Rabbi Yehuda is even arguing on the Reisha that this lishka, this so-called chamber, according to Rabbi Yehuda, was not earmarked, was not designated for the Tefillah of Mitzorah, but rather for Tefillah of Kol Adam. So again, is it that once they established the Tefillah for the Mitzorah, then they expanded it to include Kol Adam? Or no, from the get-go, this was a Makom Tefillah for Kol Adam, anyone who's going into the Azara. In any event, according to the language of Rabbi Yehuda Lo Mitzorah Bilvad, it seems quite clear that Rabbi Yehuda concedes that a Mitzorah on the 8th day of Tefillah requires, before he goes into the Azar, requires Tefillah. He's only adding that this doesn't apply exclusively to the Mitzorah, it applies to Kol Adam Shetovel. And the previous brisa, the beginning of this brisa, said that a Mitzorah does not need Tefillah on Yom HaShmini because he already had a Tefillah the night before. Lo kash. There's no contradiction here between the two statements and the two positions of Rabbi Yehuda. That which Rabbi Yehuda says that you don't need Tefillah on Yom HaShmini, that's the Tovil. He had a Tefillah on the 7th day as the halacha requires him to do so. It was Kedino. He doesn't need a second Tefillah in the morning. He's tar. We have no doubt that he's tar. But that which Rabbi Yehuda says in the Sefer of this brisa, that on Yom HaShmini he needs Tefillah, the Lo Tovel, that's a case where he wasn't Tovel. So the Gemara asks immediately the following question: Ilo Tovil Harif Shemesh Boy. If you're saying that on Yom HaShvi he was not Tovel before Harif Shemesh, when you get to Yom HaShmini and he's Tovel, then he needs Harif Shemesh of Yom HaShmini, and it'll only be after Yom HaShmini that he's tar from his tzaras, and he's allowed to put his bahonos and his yadayim and his bahonos reglayim into the azar. And if he hasn't yet had Harif Shemesh, then Tefillah on the 8th day is not going to allow him and be matir him to put his Yadayim and Bahonos into the Azara. So what do you mean when you say that he goes into the Lichkas HaMitzorayim, which is in the Ezras Noshim, and it's on the Har Bayis? He's not allowed to go in there unless, right, because a Mitzorah has Shiluach mi Gimel Machnos. Now, Tosfos vacillates in the second Tos back and forth about whether or not a mitzora during these Yemei Safra, what we spoke about, whether he's awesome with the Raisa to enter into the Azara, it could be that as far as the Azara is concerned, maybe it's awesome with the Raisa, but not as far as the Ezras Noshim is concerned. Okay, so that has to do with the laws of Tuma Vitara and Shiluach Min HaMachnos with regard to Mitzora after the counting of the 7 days. So the Gemara answers, Ella, Idi v'Idi. Both of these, whether it's what Rabbi Yehuda says that the Mitzora doesn't need a second Tefillah on Yom HaShmini, or what he says that Tovel, that he has to be Tovel, both of these cases are the Tovel. He was Tovel in Yom HaShmini. But you'll ask me, what about the brisa that seems that Rabbi Yehuda requires Tefillah on Yom HaShmini? What is that brisa telling me? It's talking about a case of the Asich Daite, that he had Hesech Hadas. In other words, you were assuming that if he had a Tefillah the night before, certainly he was very careful and meticulous, and he was aware of the fact that he would avoid Tumah at all costs between the night and the next morning when he needs to enter into the Azara. But in event that he was Masechet Das, which I don't know exactly what that means, did he go to sleep? What exactly happened, I don't know, but there was some sort of Hesech Hadas. And that's where the Brisa quotes Rabbi Yehuda saying that Brisa says that he needs another tefillah, but delo asech hadaite. And where Rabbi Yehuda does away with the requirement of tefillah on Yom HaShmini, there was no hesech hadas. He was nishmar min hatumah. He was very careful about tumah. Okay, we'll see if we can figure out exactly what constitutes hesech hadas in this context. Does Rashi give us any sort of a clue? I don't see any Rashi here. No. Mishmiras Gufa. It just says Mishmiras Gufa. So I don't know what that means. Does that mean that means he had a lapse of awareness? At some point, he wasn't careful, and we don't know that he entered into an olam mess, but maybe he did, and he didn't realize it. So the Gemara objects, Iyasach hadaite is hazos shlishi ushvi boy. Wow. The Gemara is going really far over here. That once he has Hesech Hadas, we have to really be worried about the fact that he may have entered into an olam mess without paying attention, and therefore he needs the paraduma that we read about yesterday. Right? He needs Hazah and Yom HaShlishi and Yom HaShvi. If he wasn't Shomer Min HaTumah, we're afraid that maybe he contracted Tumas mess inadvertently and without any awareness. He therefore has a Tumah of Shiva Yomim. He needs Hazah from Mefer Paraduma Yom Shlishi and Yom HaShvi. Then he has to go to the mikveh, and he needs Hariv Shemesh. So what good is the tefillah that he's Tovel on Yom HaShmini? Oh, Kida Omar, Rabbi Dostoi Bar Mosun, or Rabbi Yochanan, Hesech Hadas, Tzorech Hazah, Shlishi, Ushvi. Now, in what context was this statement of Rabbi Yochanan made? He says here, Kevon Shalom Nishmar Yesh Chashash Gomur Shenitma Betumas Mes V'Tzorech Hazah Kitomi Mes. How far-reaching is this halacha? I don't know. He says, Midivrei HaTosfos Mashma Kein Kosvich Betomei Sheretz B'Tmei Sheretz Unevela Afshet Meim Hem Yesh Lo Mishlo Yisichu Daitom Bizman Tum Osam Legabi Tumas Mes. V'Lachein Ein Tzrichim Hazah Umashma Shekshiyisiach Daito Yesh Lachshosh Shenitma Lemes. I wish I knew how far-reaching this is. Something that really needs a lot. He says, "B'pirush Rabbeinu El Yaakov Kosav she'ein chashat shachein mitma b'tumas mes el Rabbi Yochanan Omer Stvarov rak legabi tomim mes shemisiach daito mitayroso." Oh, I see. Oh, this puts things in a whole different perspective. There's a parish here on Yoma called Rabbeinu El Yaakov from one of the Rishonim. And he says that this statement of Rabbi Yochanan is addressing a case of a tummy mess. We know he's a tummy mess. And now he went through the entire process of Tara, and he had the Azov Yom Shlishi Yom Shvi, but now he was Mesiach Das. And now Rabbi Yochanan says he needs a repeat performance to be Mitayr Mitchilasa, as if nothing had happened. He needs another Azah on Shlishi and Shvi. Now, in the case of Mitzorah, since he was already Tameh as a Mitzorah, and he was Mesiach Das, he's going to have to count his 7 days of Tara all over again. And Misha Tameh Tumas Erev, V'toval V'siach Daito, Harezek Mochelo Toval V'tzarch Loshev V'litbo. So again, there's no universal halacha that a person who's Mesiach Das, we assume he's a Tameh Mes. But whatever Tumah it is, and he went through a process of Tara, he's going to have to redo that process of Tara if he was Mesiach Das. He says, "V'chein mashma miloshen atosi yishanim sherak b'tomei mes nemar din zeh shel azor aval b'tomei sheretz b'shar tumos ein she'ach klal she'yitzorch azor b'shum she'hesech das." That makes a lot more sense to me. Require azor and assume that he was tomei tumas mes just because he had hesech hadas. That seems quite revolutionary. Anyway, the Gemara concludes, "Ela idi v'idi de lo asech hadayt." In other words, the Gemara now retracts its answer, because the Gemara is saying that if it's asech hadayt, then Rabbi Yehuda requiring tvila on the 8th day would not suffice. He's got to count all over again 7 days with a new hazah on Shvi and Shlishi, on Shlishi and Shvi. So the Gemara says, no, there was no hesech hadas. V'lo kash. That which Rabbi Yehuda says that he doesn't need tefillah, did tavil al das bias migdash. Oh, this is the Rambam that we mentioned before. We didn't know where the Rambam was coming from. That the Rambam holds that there's a special requirement of tefillah as a matir to allow him to go into the Beis HaMikdash. And yesterday, meaning on the 7th day, his tefillah was only for the purpose of bahonos dada v'ragl. So he didn't have any intention of entering into the azara. Masha Omar shetzarch loshu v'likol medubar. The low tovel. Oh, I see. So the Gemara is now assuming that unless we know otherwise, we normally would assume that if the Mitzorah was Tovel on the 7th day, the reason he does so is because he's going to put his Bahonos into the Azar. And that's enough to fulfill the requirement of Tovel al Das Bias Migdash. But in the other case in the Brisa, where Rabbi Yehuda requires a second tefillah on the 8th day, that's because Lo Tovel al Das Bias Migdash. Tovel rak b'shvil litoyer mitumas mitzorah sha'olav. Now I don't know. Was he just ignorant, or why didn't he have the full-fledged das? Okay, so that we don't have an answer to exactly. He says the following: Kol tvila shetovel l'taraso nitar litzorach hadavar shalishmo tova. He says if you need tvila for two different things, let's say one is kal and one is chamur, then you need a special intention for the chamur shebo. And here, if he only had tvila l'shem tara, he didn't have tvila for entering into the migdash. Eno nitar l'davar chamur b'min. And this apparently is a sugya Masechet Chagiga. Haval lemaser, huchzak lemaser, but also the truma. Wow, he has to have a specific intention when he was tovel that he's going to eat truma. Tovel truma, huchzak the truma, but also the kodesh. You can't eat kodesh. Why came in tovel b'shvil lios muta b'truma, huchzak kitar li truma, v'lo li inyan achilas kodesh. Lachem mitzor shetovel litar min atuma. Lo huchsa kitar linyan likanes lemigdash. Now he has a kasha from the Chazon Ish. Madua hagmar lo mitaretzes. Came on shisiach daito mitumas sheretz. Kigon shisiach daito mitumas sheretz v'lo shisiach daito mitumas mes. I guess he had in mind that he wanted to be tovel from tumas sheretz, but not from tumas mes. Lachein eno tzorich lechakos shivas yomim el yochel litfol hayom. All right, I don't follow the kasha of the Chazon Ish. Ravina Omar, let's see if we can still. All right, we'll try to fit in another 5 minutes. Ravina Omar, that we have a girsa lo mitzoran bilvad. So that which Rabbi Yehuda said l'divrei d'Rabbanan komali, he was talking according to the Rabbanan shita. Liditi, according to my shita, mitzora ain't tzarch tvila. He already had a tvila on the 7th day. Liditchu, but according to you, oduli easy mias. A mitzora should require a second tefillah on Yom HaShmini. At least that you should agree. What does the word easy mean? Easy is a tevas tikun lashon. In other words, easy means you should correct your language. So Rabbi Yehuda is saying to Chachamim, you should at least admit to this. The lo mitzoran bilvad amru ela kol adam. Anyone, according to the Rabbanan, who goes into the Mikdash, even if he's tar, he needs tefillah in order to remind him that maybe jolt his memory, maybe he had a tummi shana, and therefore the requirement of tefillah should not be limited to the mitzvah; it should apply to kol adam who's entering into the Mikdash, even if we know he's tar. For Rabbanan, mitzvah diyesh betuma, dayesh betuma, or diyesh betuma. In other words, the mitzvah was in a state of tuma, so he gets used to contact, having contact with tuma. So therefore, even though he was tar yesterday, on the 7th day, we're always afraid that maybe he came into a contact with a davar tuma. So he needs a second tar, a tefillah, before he goes into the Azor on the 8th day. But kol adam lo daishi betuma, he's not rugil for tuma. He will naturally be shomer. He'll be careful not to come in contact with tuma. Therefore, if he has a cheskes tara, we don't require a tefillah before he goes into the mikdash. We see clearly from Ravina that he understood that according to Chachamim, a person who goes into the mikdash does not require tefillah. And the Gemara now is going to analyze that premise. Amalei Abayla Rav Yosef Neymar Rabbanan the Polig Aleid Rav Yehuda. Shall we assume that the Rabbanan who disagree with Rav Yehuda and they hold that a mitzvah needs tefillah on Yom HaShmini ben Zoma svirule. Maybe they accept the Kal V'chomer ben Zoma, from which we derive a doraisa chiv that anyone who goes into the Beis Hamikdash, even if he's tar, he requires a tefillah, and that's why they say that a mitzvah has to be tovel, even though he was tovel the night before Shmini, the Erev before Shmini. So you'll ask, why does it say mitzora tovel v'omed? After all, every person needs a tefillah before he goes into the Mikdash. If you accept Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, I mean, lo diacha kocho di Rabbi Yehuda. He wants to tell you how far Rabbi Yehuda is going. He's willing to go as far as to say that the mitzora doesn't need tefillah because he was tovel be'erev, even though another person would need tefillah. O Dilma, should we say, shiny mitzora de dayish bituma? That we're not accepting necessarily Ben Zoma as a blanket, all-inclusive requirement that anyone who goes into the Azor needs tefillah, but only a mitzora who's ragil bituma, therefore he needs tefillah. But other bnei adam don't require tefillah. So the Chachamim would hold that a general person, the balance of the population does not need tefillah before entering into the Mikdash, and it's only the case of a mitzvah that requires tefillah before he enters into the Mikdash, because even though he was told yesterday, we're afraid that he may have contracted tumah, and that's a special chashash with regard to a mitzvah. So this is the Gemara's suffix here. The Gemara vacillates on this point, and that's what Abai was asking Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef responded, "Shani mitzvah the daish betuma." It's only a mitzvah who's ragil betuma. Therefore, the Chacham require that he be tovel. But Shar b'nei Adam, who's not ragil betuma, they have a cheskes tara. They don't need tefillah before they enter into the Mikdash.